Well, today's topic and reading covered a lot. Okay, when I looked over it, I was like, this is just so much. It was like it's kind of all over the place. But what I decided to do is like kind of pick the title of the article, Foreign Aid, New Players, New Goals, question mark. And what I want to try and do today is kind of zero in on those two topics. The goals of foreign aid, or how foreign aid, the goals of foreign aid have evolved, and also how players have evolved over the years in terms of who's involved in foreign aid and delivering foreign aid. And essentially, I'm going to focus mainly on NGOs and non-governmental organizations. I organized a bit some notes on private foundations, but I don't think we're going to get there because we have another speaker, and so I'm probably going to cut my remarks off just talking about NGOs. So what I want to do is kind of talk a little bit about these new players, specifically NGOs, but then also talk about how their evolution has really been paralleling also patterns in foreign policy in terms of foreign aid and foreign aid delivery. And even though, hopefully, Deborah Newman will talk a little bit more about this, it's a lot of what NGOs do is based on private philanthropy, based on this kind of voluntarism, etc. There has been a huge component of state support for all of this. So I'm going to zero in on the state policy side of that for most of my presentation. Right. Okay, as a scholar of NGOs, I've studied a lot of different areas of global activism. And one big area we've seen really a huge surge of activism and growth is the area of NGOs and area of international development. And while private actors have been active in global issues for a very long time, I think the past 2 or 3 decades we've really seen a big kind of increase in visibility and in numbers of these private aid efforts. Who are some of the private actors that are now involved in foreign aid or foreign-like aid-like activities like international development? Well, NGOs, which I'll talk about, and private foundations are kind of at the forefront because they've been doing this for a very, very long time. But in addition to that, we've also seen a lot of other actors that are private actors are now very involved in all sorts of international charity efforts. I'm sure all of you can name at least one celebrity that you know that's involved. Bono, Madonna, who else can we think of? Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, and pardon? Bill Gates, Richard Branson. I mean, I'm sure you can all think of some wealthy person or celebrity who's out there doing some good cause. And almost every celebrity has a foundation, has something like that. So many people are now involved in their personal efforts going around the world trying to do good and help out. In addition to that, there are also a lot of corporate type of efforts going out there. There's a whole new area called social entrepreneurship, where you have for-profit charity operations. There are operations that are set up with business goals, but the proceeds all go to doing good and to investing in all sorts of areas, building schools or spreading information technology in third world, etc. Finally, another area that people don't always think about, but I think is actually really become a huge area that private actors have become very important in international development, are diaspora immigrant communities. We know of all communities here that live in the United States, but in Europe, as well as in Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, Singapore, immigrants in all of these countries send money back to their home countries. That's now in the billions of dollars. And is a form of aid that people don't always think about, but has definitely become enormous. Literally billions and billions of dollars. It's a whole separate form of aid that's happening in channels we don't see or hear about, and it's not written about as much, but it's having a very big impact on how international development forms in the third world. So those are some of the big kind of new players. What I want to do today is focus more on NGOs, because NGOs is the area that I've done a lot of work and I find very, very interesting. Well, NGOs are now one of the major players in international development and one of the major deliverers of foreign aid, as well as active at grassroots level, national level, international level, etc. There are now literally tens of thousands of NGOs all over the world, active in all the different areas of international development. And And these are not only American NGOs and European NGOs and Japanese NGOs, they're also NGOs in the developing world, in developing countries. So I think right now it's, when foreign aid started, and I'll get back to this later, when foreign aid started, there weren't that many NGOs in the developing world. You would go out there, you'd go out and work in different communities. Now it's impossible to imagine international development without NGOs. Like, how would you get anything done? It's such a common thing that there are very few countries you can go to without turning to them to implement a lot of these projects and do a lot of these projects. So what are some of the roots of, kind of the historical roots of NGOs that work in the area of international development? Because international NGOs that work in the area of international development are only one sector. Okay, there are many other NGOs out there. Some of them are human rights, and they're actually just working for changing policy in human rights, or they're environmental activist NGOs like Greenpeace. But they're different than the ones that we're going to kind of look at today, which are really ones that are going out there trying to stimulate development, improve life, and improve the welfare of people in developing countries. Well, the roots of these sort of NGOs really go back at least a couple of centuries. If you think about the roots of some of the European NGOs, where their roots are in missionaries and in churches that were spread all around the world during the colonial period. Because in addition to doing kind of proselytizing and trying to get converts, a lot of the missionaries, a lot of what they did was basically social welfare type of work in many of the colonies. They built schools, they built orphanages, they built clinics and health clinics, essentially a lot of what they continue to do after the war in another form. And in fact, many of the NGOs that work out there, especially some of the European ones, are faith-based NGOs that come from that kind of tradition and that trajectory. The other precursor of modern day NGOs are relief efforts that started actually also in the 19th century. It dates back actually even before the potato famine in Ireland. That was one of the big relief efforts. But you have these international kind of relief efforts from North America, from different parts of Europe, when a big catastrophe or humanitarian crisis took place. The turning point, though, was in the 20th century, because those were kind of one-time efforts where people would mobilize their communities and send all different kinds of aids to the trouble spot, wherever it was in the world. The turning point came, I think, in the 20th century with the World War I and World War II. These were massive, destructive wars, and out of this came a lot of organized groups that not only responded to relief efforts then, but after the war ended and after the relief thing happened, they stayed. They didn't go away, and they continued. So some of the famous NGOs that came out of World War I and World War II are like Save the Children, which came out of World War I, and the guest speaker we have today, CARE, which came out of World War II, and efforts to help with relief efforts and reconstruction right after World War II. Well, in the post-war period, NGOs working in international development has really, the numbers and the activities has really dramatically increased. Again, the phenomenon really started in the West with development NGOs in America, Canada, and Europe, increasing in size and numbers since the 1950s. Now, although these groups were already existent in the 50s and 60s, there were quite a few numbers of them. What we've seen really since I'd say the late 70s, the 80s, and the 90s is an explosion in numbers of these types of groups. And not only in the explosion of their numbers, but the explosion in their budgets, in their staff, and the number of countries that they work in. So that now you have enormous organizations. I mean, we still have, there's a big range when you look at all different kinds of NGOs out there. There's small ones that are just working in one country with one sort of fund. But we now have some of the most professionalized, large NGO kind of operations. They're really quite different from the starting point, pre-war kind of starting point. And are enormous, very professional operations. Just to give you a few examples, World Vision in 2006 had a budget of close to $1 billion, $950 million. a staff of 20,000, and they had projects and programs in almost 100 countries. CARE has always been a big leader in this field as well, and I'm really excited that we have CARE here because I think they're a great organization. In 2006, they had a budget of close to $600 million and programs in 66 countries. Save the Children, another NGO you've probably all heard of, has grown enormously. In 2006, it also had a budget. It had a budget of about $330 million and programs in about 50 different countries. So these are a really different scale, they're like multinational corporations, but they're multinational nonprofits, you know, with huge operations, big staff, and doing a lot of stuff. But in addition to Western NGOs, as I mentioned earlier, we've also seen a really large explosion in the number of NGOs in developing countries. And I think here the boom has been even more pronounced, with now literally hundreds of thousands of NGOs in many, many different countries in Africa, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and in Latin America. And most of them are fairly small scale, but we do have some extremely large NGOs also in the developing world. BRAC, a very well-known Bangladesh NGO, for example, now has a budget of about $245 million. It has a staff of 97,000 people. It runs tens of thousands of schools in Bangladesh. It runs also a huge microfinance program, health clinics, and a bunch of economic development programs, and has literally touched more than 1 million lives. So it's very, very impressive when you see how developed and how extensive many of these NGOs are. So that's kind of a quick summary of a little brief presentation of kind of the rise of NGO and the rising importance of them in terms of international development. But what I want to do now is kind of quickly, because I know I need to give time for Deb Newman as well, kind of give you an overview of how this growth of NGOs has actually been parallel or evolved along with changing foreign policies and official aid. Okay, I think one of the most striking things about foreign aid policy over the past few years is that what we've seen is an enormous amount of foreign aid now going to NGOs. Basically, NGOs have always been part of foreign aid. They've always received some state funding, but the amount of it has really become enormous. It's a multi-billion-dollar source of funding right now. If you combine foreign aid from the United States, the United States government provides, Canada, Europe, the EU, there's somewhere between $8 and $10 billion a year of foreign aid being channeled through NGOs. $8 to $10 billion is a lot of money. You know, private philanthropy is more than that, but that's still a huge amount of money. And if you add in about another $3 billion from the UN, money that's channeled to NGOs through the UN, you have even more money. So let me just quickly note some of these trends, because I think they've been quite remarkable. In the 70s, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, one of the main development agencies, official bilateral aid agencies in the United States, channeled about 1.5, less than 2% of its aid through NGOs. In the 80s, this increased to about 13%. In the 1990s, the official goal was to channel 25% of all of USAID's money through NGOs. And in the 90s, between about 15 and 20% of foreign aid went through NGOs. Both NGOs based from the United States as well as developing country NGOs. For one of the classes that I teach, I recently checked a recent USAID report and found out that in 2006, the total amount of U.S. government funding going to just the American NGOs was $3.5 billion. So $3.5 billion of your tax dollars for foreign aid is being channeled through NGOs, and is being given to NGOs who do projects all over the world. And if you included some of the developing country NGOs and other things, it would be higher, it would be about $4 million. The Europeans and the Canadians also love NGOs, and their amount of their foreign aid has really been very generous to NGOs as well. They provided about the same amount, I think, in the 70s as the United States did, but in the 80s and 90s, anywhere between 15 and 25, and sometimes even 30% of their aid has also been funneled and channeled through NGOs. Scandinavian countries are very generous. They've always been had very close ties to their NGOs, especially Norway and Sweden. The Netherlands, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, these are countries that have been very kind of NGO-centric in a lot of their funding. In addition to bilateral agencies, the UN now also relies very, very heavily on NGOs to get its work done. And somewhere between $2 to $3 billion a year is given out to NGO in the form of grants, contracts, and those sort of things in all of these different UN agencies. And this is because the UN often has a very small staff. It can't really do the programs itself. It has to either give money to governments or it gives them to NGOs. And over the years, it's relied more and more heavily on NGOs. Just to give you a couple examples of that, because they really, the UN system really does rely on NGOs quite a bit. The World Bank has become a very active promoter of NGOs since the 90s. It was not necessarily a big promoter of NGOs, but started a program with small grants, and now claims that about 70% of all the projects it funds has some component that involves an NGO. So either it's an evaluator, an implementer, or a consultant. Some part of each World Bank project, supposedly, according to the World Bank, has an NGO also there doing part of the work. Two UN organizations that have always relied heavily on NGOs but have done so, have had bigger budgets and had more action in the past 2 decades are the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the World Food Program. Whenever there's a humanitarian crisis, whenever there's a refugee camp setting up, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has to go there. The World Food Program goes there and brings emergency aid. Who does the World Food Program, who does UNHCR use to do the delivery? NGOs. They have literally 1,000 NGO partners, both local as well as international NGOs, and a lot of the program delivery, if they didn't have NGOs, I don't know who they would get to do the job, because they can't do it themselves. And because of that, another couple $2 billion has gone to all of that. So when you read a lot of the literature, and some people have been quite critical of this, is that in the 80s and 90s, what we've seen is this enormous amount of official money going to NGOs. That was not that big before. There's always some there, but a huge amount now going to NGOs. You know, I think for most U.S. NGOs, they're not overly reliant on government funding, but this has been kind of a question mark. You know, how with all of this money out there, a lot of NGOs are chasing the money, and it raises all different kinds of issues and dilemmas as well. And particularly, I think, for NGOs in developing countries where you don't have very many resources to begin with, they get there's a risk of relying a lot on official aid. So I think, am I running tight on time? Okay. I was going to actually go, there was more that I wanted to say. What I wanted to do, I'm trying to wrap this up quickly, is just kind of say, why is it that we're spending all this money on NGOs? Okay, because we went from a small amount now to like, you know, $10, $15 billion a year from Western countries mainly and channeled through the UN. Well, it's been part of the evolution of foreign policy and the evolution of foreign aid. And I think it's been interrelated to several things. One is that the ideology of foreign aid and kind of how people think, decision makers think, this is, if we do this, we're going to get the good result. And then that plus a combination of global politics and international relations and kind of political uses of NGOs and the changing, shifting rationales for political uses of NGOs, because they've changed over the years. And essentially, what we moved from, because I don't want to talk very much longer, and if people are interested, we could talk about this later. Essentially, we moved from a foreign aid model that started in the 50s, very Cold War mentality, supporting our allies through foreign aid, and have aid go to governments, have aid go to leaders in the country who would then build the infrastructure, big projects, kind of to build up an economy that way. We moved from that to thinking about aid as poverty reduction, and not be just economic growth and funding big infrastructure things, but why is it that there's still so many poor people when we put so much money into this? That was a shift in the 70s. To the 80s and 90s, where we also had the end of the Cold War and no more reasons to support dictators for Cold War reasons, and democracy being a goal, and thinking, well, instead of just giving money to states, we should be giving money to people that are going to get the aid closer to the people on the ground. So kind of circumvent, give government some money, but also give private sector money, give NGOs money, spread the aid around so that it'll actually reach the poor, because there was a lot of things in the 80s that it was clear that the aid was not reaching the poor. It was going in other directions. It was going to governments that weren't spending it right. And so giving money to NGOs was one way to kind of circumvent some of those problems. And it's become a big kind of, NGOs became the magic bullet. It was going to solve a lot of the problems that were considered the dysfunctional aspects of foreign aid. I'm going to stop my comments right there and turn this over now to Ted for 2 minutes. What? Oh, let me try to start this.
Great. I just also want to say thanks so much for having me here tonight. It's always a pleasure to get out into the community. And what I'd like to do is say to Kim, I mean, she did such a great job of painting all the money that's out there from aid. I should tell you my job, among other things, is to try to help build the support from private folks, from philanthropists, private philanthropists. And I think it's important to set a context that for all the aid that is out there, the scope of the problem, and I'm going to just share with you a little bit and tell you what CARE is about, the magnitude of that is equally huge. So CARE is an organization like a lot of these other NGOs that really deals with the problem of how do you help get the 2 billion people in the world who live on less than $2 a day out of that condition. You know, that's kind of the scope of the problem. And what I thought I could do, and then there's one other point I would make just before I set up comments, that it is, well, it's quite true that the evolution of these NGOs, which by the way is a word I have to admit I didn't really know much about during my life in the corporate world. That acronym there were many others that were part of my vocabulary, but that wasn't one of them. That an organization like CARE or Save the Children or World Vision and the many thousands of others, we're focused on helping poor people get out of poverty. We're focused on emergency relief. We have a humanitarian mandate. And so while it's true that our growth in many ways has been through partnership with state governments, whether it's the U.S. or the U.K. or other institutions, there are times when the policies of state don't really necessarily intersect with the humanitarian mandate of feeding, people in poverty or in conflict war situations. Thus, the importance for having a diversified resource base that includes members of the American public or other publics around the world that are actually supporting that humanitarian mandate. So I just want to leave that, and as we get back into Q&A and talk about what I'm going to do, those are a couple thoughts I want to plant up front. So with that, what I'd like to do is maybe just spend a couple of minutes. How many of you do know about CARE or heard of CARE? This is a great audience, and it's because it depends, depending on what kind of an audience I'm talking to and what your demographic profile is, I'll get a different showing of hands. Anybody that's, dare I say it, over 40 tends to know something about CARE. If I'm out talking to college students, it's a different story. But so I'd like to do is share with you just a little bit of the history, which I guess many of you do know. But yeah, okay. And then after that, I'd like to just show you a few facts about funding, how the American public funds charity in general, and then how that plays out in an NGO like CARE. So, since you all know, and Kim's remarks were really helpful, we were founded after the war. We were founded to help bring the poor and suffering Europeans after World War II out of that condition with the tremendous outpouring of the American public in this case. I think CARE is really one of those interesting, great, and I've never actually quite expressed it this way. We talk a lot in the NGO world about public-private partnership. This was a great example of the American government, through its leftover ration packages that were used to the American servicemen, in partnership with the Americans who wanted to pay for those packages to really help solve a major emergency humanitarian crisis after World War II. Following that, though, CARE has grown enormously, and I'm not going to go through the stages of our growth, but I will say, echoing Kim's remarks, we moved from a pure sort of almost niche humanitarian emergency relief organization to become one of the world's largest international development organizations focused on being a global force and partner of change in a worldwide movement to dedicated to its ambitious goal, ending poverty. I mean, it's a very visionary statement, but that's what we believe. And in addition, we want to be known for our commitment to the dignity of people. And so there's a real human rights dimension to how we think about fighting poverty, and not just dealing with that at sort of the Band-Aid level of relief, but getting to sustainable solutions, which often deal with focusing on issues like the marginalization of groups, whether they be women who are the most marginalized in the world, or untouchables in the Indian community and other groups like that. I'm not really going to dwell too much on this. If you have questions about what we do and how we do it, I'd be happy to answer them. But we do promote the kinds of, I'm about to follow up with things, solutions that you see here. And we have an approach that really is rooted in getting right into the communities that we serve. So CARE is an organization of 13,000 people, and we work in, today, 71 countries around the world, reaching 65 million people. The vast majority of CARE employees, CARE workers, are, and I would say it's probably 98% of them, are nationals of the countries that we work in. So we're in India, we're in Bangladesh, we're all through primarily Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Africa, Asia, Latin America. And most of our team are people like you or I or others in social services who are come from the communities themselves, which is a tremendous strength, because really in the end it's really pretty difficult to, the old model, parachute people in from outside. This is people from within their communities, helping their communities focus on what is it that we, in terms of our communities, need to do to solve our own problems. That said, and now I'm going to just touch briefly on our evolution. We do work in a broad array of sectors, from working on problems of HIV and AIDS, to helping communities get clean water, to putting a focus on basic and girls' education, reaching the most marginalized children in the world, children, often some of them who are child laborers in very rural communities, get access to basic education. And we put a special focus on girls who are more marginalized even than the poor boys in terms of access. We are an emergency relief organization, very active in almost all of the major emergencies, the South Asian tsunami, the cyclone in Bangladesh, with climate change, or if you see it that way, there are going to be increased emergencies, so we're engaged in that. But one of the things I want to share with you, I won't go into this, but it's important. I cannot talk to a public group about who we are and what we do without giving a little bit of a commercial for us, and to give some explanation to that, how these organizations have evolved. What CARE has recognized in all the work we've done over the past 63 years is that if you want to solve the problems of poverty and move international development, there are many, many paths to doing that. In fact, you need to bring many different kinds of interventions together. It's the same in our country as well. It's true everywhere there's poverty. But what we have seen in our work is that women and girls in the developing world are the most marginalized group of all, and that's one piece of the equation. But the other piece is that investing in their development, because of their role as the heart of the family, and is one of the greatest leverage points for changing the needle on poverty. And I won't go into that in any depth, but I just wanted to, in sharing about who CARE is, say that we place greater emphasis in more recent times on focus on, through all of the interventions we do, on helping girls and women have greater access to services in healthcare and education, etc. That is not to the exclusion of boys and men. It's really actually in service of helping them be better participants in society. So having said that, as kind of setting the stage about what this particular NGO is and what we do, I thought it might be interesting, and then we can move to discussion, to share a little bit about how the American public funds charity, or NGOs. I don't think most people in the public think about it as NGO. And then a little bit about how that looks like in CARE. So, this is a chart that there's an organization called Giving USA, which for 50 years has tracked philanthropic giving in the United States. And, as you can see, it's I should have the number here. We've given Americans in 2005, the number was slightly higher in 2006, gave approximately $260 billion in philanthropic support of a wide range, and I'll show that in the next slide. I moved it to a wide range of organizations, and the next slide will show you that. This is how it breaks down in terms of giving. Still, the vast majority, almost, I think it's close to 80%, maybe a little bit more than 80%, comes from individuals. So, and as much as we hear about Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation, and the Buffetts, and all the major foundations, the Rockefeller, and many, many foundations, and they're very important players, it's really people like you and others who reach out and give out of their own pocket through churches, directly to NGOs and charities. That is the vast majority still of private giving in the United States. That's followed by the foundations, this is someone who worked with me used to say, living people and dead people, because the second largest category are the bequests that come through wills of people who generally gave their whole life and have also left something for the causes that they supported. The next are the foundations we've talked about, and those are some of the major foundations, but also private family foundations, people of wealth, but perhaps not quite at the level of Gates. And then corporations. Corporations are a very interesting animal. In my opinion, I come from one. I come from one of the great ones that provides great philanthropic support. But, companies are about, as everybody is, tying what they do to their mission and ensuring that there's a sound, not only philanthropic purpose to what they do, but a sound tie-back generally to the mission of the organization. So that kind of, the work of corporations tends to be quite fascinating, but very complex negotiation and design. Here's, I think, an interesting chart. We follow this one a lot at CARE. This looks at the $260 billion that's given in this country and breaks it down by the sectors. Religion, religious giving being the largest by far. What's difficult with that is we all know that many people who give for their religious organizations, that money is often going to support missionaries or to support the work of organizations like World Vision or other NGOs that are religious, faith-based. So that's a little bit of work to sometimes tease apart what those dollars do and where they go. That is, and I'm sure will continue for a long time, to be where the greatest source of private giving comes from. What I would just stop and point out on this chart is if you look at international affairs, that's the sector that CARE is in, and Save the Children and these other NGOs. It's 2.5. It's a lot, 2.5% of total giving in the United States. And while that's a great, the actual number of $6 billion is a very generous and good number, it's clearly not the place most Americans are thinking about in terms of their giving. What's changing here, I think, is we've become a more globalized world as Bonos and others are out there, and as we recognize that the problems of the outside world and the poverty that people live in and the turmoil that results really does impact all of us. You sort of can't hide from that anymore. So what I think is tremendous, I think that this will grow as Americans and other developed nations recognize the importance of trying to help, that the benefiting those other economies really ultimately plays back to us. On that note, I have to read this thing. We talked about celebrities for a minute. Did anybody, one celebrity we left out, is Oprah. So I don't know how many of you watched the debut of her new TV show. I didn't watch it. I forgot to watch it. It's called The Big Give, and I thought I would just read you from her website, how she promotes this. Because I think it speaks to the consciousness of some of the things that we're seeing in America these days in terms of the importance of philanthropy. But she says, are you America's greatest unknown philanthropist? Are you the type of person who makes things happen and will do whatever it takes? This is the casting call for her reality show. Do you have a big personality and lots of charisma? Are you ready to pay it forward? Harpo Productions is pleased to announce the first primetime network series, The Big Give. This show is all about inspiring people around the country to do good for others. I am skeptical, somewhat about this kind of stuff, but I do have to say, when it gets to Oprah, you've got me. So I grew up watching, and probably some of you did, that show, The Millionaire, where somebody goes around and gives money out. I think this is kind of a new take on that, and there are moments when I, living in this world of helping to fight poverty, sometimes get skeptical about the hype that surrounds the philanthropy, but I do think the intentions behind these kinds of things are good, and that's what I kind of ground myself in. I know I'm just going to take a couple more minutes and kind of show you then, if you come back to CARE, and you have the landscape I showed you about giving from privately philanthropy, let me show you, and this echoes kind of what Kim said. This is our fiscal year 07 total revenue, which was, slightly under $600 million. And in the purple, the top of the pie, 116, that represents private giving. All of those sources, individuals, corporations, private foundations, bequests, etc., that the public gives to CARE. And then the larger, much larger slice of that pie is what Kim was talking about. That's funding from not just USAID, but also funding that we as an international entity, because CARE is an international organization, receive from other, the British aid organization, the Canadian aid organization, the Scandinavians, Nordics, and others, as well as some, not very much, but some World Bank funding, a little bit of World Bank funding, and UN, etc. So that's kind of how it looks from a big NGO. We are probably much more so than World Vision, more heavily reliant on that kind of funding. World Vision gets a great deal more funding from the private, mostly through religious giving. And one of the big challenges for CARE, and this echoes where I started, is, number one, we advocate for the USAID budgets to be protected. We do a lot of work in Washington to influence and shape policy on these things and on spending. But it's really important for an organization like us to broaden our base of support beyond and become less dependent on government funding. Going back to what I said earlier, because the intersection of what our interest is as a humanitarian organization some of you may have heard that CARE turned down. People get confused about this, but that we several months ago announced that we would no longer take or support money from the U.S. government that was for the monetization of food aid. It doesn't mean we are not doing food aid or that we don't use and take so many, but there's a big program to provide aid through the monetization of food, and that's something that we, through many, many years, I mean, we're one of the world's biggest food aid providers, but we've just found it to be not very inefficient and also something that suppresses growth of local markets. And so those are the kind of places where, but when you do that, that's for us, over several years, a $40 million hit in our budgets, which have hit for Latin America in particular pretty hard. So we'll say more on that. Just wanted to share that as a teaser. We can talk later. So then I will just wrap it up by saying I thought I would just show you two pie charts. It may be a little bit hard to see the detail on this, but the top one, the bottom represents what I told you about. That's Giving USA in a pie chart. That's the funding that came in, it's I think FY06. And just shows you the sources of funding, once again, with the big blue piece being the individuals, and et cetera, et cetera. And then how that maps for CARE. And we don't need to get into that in detail, but just to show you that our funding tends to be a little bit more heavily influenced by foundations. The Gates Foundation in particular is very much in the area that CARE works on, the health services, health care. They're getting into agricultural development. They care about water issues, microfinance. So they are a significant, I think they can be a bigger, more significant funder, but we are probably disproportionately favoring corporations. That's a good thing for us, but it's complicated. We do better than I think many NGOs in our appeal to companies. We're not as good as we would like to be in terms of reaching the broad American public and building that continued base of support, which was our heritage. I mean, we really were an iconic sort of mass organization in the very beginning when we were the care package organization. So I'm going to really stop here and let us open up to Q&A, and I hope that gives you a look at who we are and how the money flows.
Question for Deborah. Would you explain monetization of food?
Yeah. When I came to CARE, that's a great question. My first week at CARE, I came in April, so maybe this was May. CARE does an annual sort of gala event in Washington, D.C., where ambassadors open up their homes to our donors, and we have a wonderful dinner and an anniversary celebration. So suffice it to say, I'm there no longer than a month. I came from IBM. I didn't know about this whole world, and I get to drive to the gala with this man with a shipping company, and he ships food overseas, food aid, but I didn't know all that. The first thing he said to me, his wife is in the car, he said, "So what do you think about the monetization policy?" And I'm like freaking out. Excuse me, and his wife was very, very nice, and she had to help me out. Well, she didn't know either, but what it is, essentially, one of the ways, it's not just the U.S. government, the Europeans, I believe, do this as well, help to provide and boost money available for development aid beyond just handing out food, is they purchase surplus food from farmers, provide that food to an organization like CARE. I'm simplifying this a lot. Then allow us to ship that, or they ship it, and there's a whole shipping of it, which is a heavy cost, overseas, where then CARE will sell the food in the local markets, and we're able to take the money that we sold for the food to put it into the other kinds of programming. So that can be programming. Now, it needs to be programming that's somehow related to generally nutrition and health. But so in order for a very long time, this has been attractive to NGOs, including us, because it helps us get much needed money to do programs like education. So we might combine a school feeding program with a lot of the work that you do to boost and build an education program. That's what monetization is. So it's this kind of circular thing where you buy food, you pay to ship it overseas, it's inefficient to get it overseas. When you do it, the problem is costly to administer it because we need to maintain all staff to buy it, sell it, etc. And the other problem is it can cause a problem in the local markets where local farmers are now the market is flooded with this food and they can't sell their products. So that's monetization. It's been a very controversial issue, but I didn't know about that when I was in the car with that guy on my first month.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm also a graduate, a three-decade graduate of the same great corporation that you came from, Deborah. So I'm not sure who the question's for. It's kind of a half-full, half-empty jump ball question. Maybe it's for Kim. I'm wondering, given the point you made about the increasing shift of foreign aid into NGO channels, whether you think that reflects merely a desire for more efficient delivery in the doing well that's tied to our own either corporate or foreign policy goals, or whether it's a conscious shift to more doing good.
I'll start. Do you want to say something? Yeah, I didn't really talk that much about. I kind of ended a little early on why the reasons for some of this shift, and certainly I think the cost effectiveness was one of the goals. Okay, and in the 80s, when this whole shift of how we administer foreign aid that was starting, the whole debate was we did all these studies on NGOs and why NGOs and what would be good about NGOs, and cost effectiveness was one of them. Although it's questionable, actually, if they really are more cost effective. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. There have been a bunch of studies, there's been nothing definitive, and it really depends on the project, it depends on something, and I mean, it's part of also the question of what is a good result sometimes. How can you show, I mean, you go in poverty, it continues, and you can have some concrete things to show, but what USAID wants sometimes is not really necessarily an improvement. They just want means to count, and it's very complicated. It gets very complicated. But I think that there were a bunch of reasons. One of them was corrupt governments, putting foreign aid into Swiss bank accounts, which was tolerated for a long time because of the Cold War. And basically, we're fighting with the Soviet Union. We wanted more countries on our side versus their countries. So we had a lot of bad policies because of that, I think. But after, this was in the 80s and 90s, the Cold War ended. There was no reason to tolerate this anymore. And so how do you get, part of the shift was focusing on good governance, focusing on all these other issues. More people participation, good governance, promoting democracy became a big goal with the end of the Cold War. And all of these types of goals, NGOs had been already doing this work, were already active in the field, and it seemed like a more efficient way to kind of go around some of the bad governments and go directly to, quote unquote, the people. Now, there are problems, okay? There's been a backlash against NGOs because of all this funding that went in there, and there are a lot of dysfunctional things that came out of all of this money being thrown out there as well. I think overall, in balance, it's done more good than harm, but it's certainly not. The fact that so much money is out there and available to them has also caused a lot of the question marks and stuff like that as well. So anyway, I talked a bit too much, but anyway.
No, I would, and I think you gave a great explanation. A couple other points to reinforce some of this. I know that, at least speaking from the care perspective, one of the things that we built up as a core capability over time was a very strong audit and control staff, not just here in the U.S., but in the countries we operated in. And so as the government is looking to put money into these places, and they want to make sure that it is administered as effectively as it can be in ways that could be trusted. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't glitches or problems, because there were and there still are. But I think the U.S. government has typically, and it's one of the strengths and one of the reasons we have been a big recipient is because we've been very responsible user. The other thing, and I'm commenting now from only 5 years in this field, but you know, if you look back 20 or 30 years ago, you referred to the growth of local NGOs. Well, many of those local participants weren't there. So, and I speak, you know, CARE, a lot of what we do is actually to work to build the capabilities and capacity of local partners. And since here from IBM, I'll give an analogy. I went to the services division of IBM, and you know, a lot of what we did was what we do in that division is work with business partners. And in a way, you know, I sort of resonate with you, and we talk a lot about facilitating and leveraging other people and leveraging and building capacity of other partners as opposed to just this very tangible, you know, here's the computer. For NGOs like CARE or any players in this group, a lot of what, in order to really reach a goal of helping a society improve and develop, you need to help be part of the process of helping build the sustainable capacity in that community. And so that's a big focus of what we do. And I think the government, coming back to government funding of that, is there weren't a lot of robust local charities or NGOs. You know, today there are more and more of them. And I think the shift for big NGOs like CARE is to actually be able to work effectively and not do all the work we do, but be able to be, in a way, an integrator of partners in those societies. Question over here with the woman with the age. Yeah, raise this evening.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. It seems to me that so much of what the NGOs do and what the UN does, the World Food Program, the Refugee Program, the World Health Organization, and CARE, UNICEF, so much of the time is interrupted. The work you've done has been destroyed by war and violence and conflict, and whether it be civil or cross-border or whatever it is. Does CARE, and maybe you can say generally speaking, do the larger NGOs, when they see a crisis coming, do they really, and they know it's going to follow, do they make any efforts to try to prevent this from happening? Do they talk to the politicians involved and the country governments involved and try to keep this from happening so the work can be carried on?
The answer is yes. I mean, it's one of the areas that is lesser known about CARE, and I'm sure other NGOs, is that while we started as a service organization, we more and more are engaged in advocacy and policy, you know, and that's both on the ground in the countries we operate and trying to influence government policies in those countries, and also in Washington. Now, that said, so I'll speak to a couple things. So, and this is not as much as this. So, in a place like Darfur, where we're on the ground and working in you know, with displaced people who are suffering terribly, we have this very tricky balance of carrying out that work with a government that is awful, but behind the scenes, we're doing a lot of advocacy work with other NGOs and other organizations advocating and working, you know, for change. We also call out for change in that situation in Washington. That's one of the most tricky and terrible of the situations. But I'll give you another one, which is, I think, more positive. We do a lot of work in maternal health. And I don't know how much you all know about the maternal mortality rates around the world, but they're terrible in many places where they don't need to be. And so, you know, I think 500,000 women a year still die in childbirth, and much of this is preventable. We do a lot, and I'll give you that. So just as one small example, in CARE all over the world we work in trying to find solutions to some of this, but particularly in Peru is a good example, in the Andean region of Peru. We have done work to not only try to help, you know, there's a number of ways that you can help solve this problem in terms of the service, getting better transportation, transportation vehicles, working with the communities to strengthen the local hospitals, and working with women themselves and their families to convince them to go to those hospitals. So there's all that. But the other piece of work is, and this is where we've been very engaged, is once we have success in these areas, we've done a lot of work to advocate with the Peruvian government to show this impact of those results, and actually working with local politicians and others advocate for health policies that actually are much more proactive in putting in place the things that we know can work. So I speak for CARE, but I know that there are others, organizations where the policy and advocacy piece of what we do is becoming increasingly important, because either in the prevention or the stopping or the changing of some of those crises that make ultimate getting out of poverty not possible. Did you want to add?
Well, I'll just quickly say, this is actually a whole area that people actually been studying, trying to examine the different roles NGOs play in various parts of crises. Okay, so you have the crisis coming, the crisis happened, the crisis, and then the wind down of the crisis. And NGOs are there all the time. Okay, the 90s was a big kind of lessons learned. Rwanda, a bunch of different cases. In many of these cases, there were actually NGOs trying to get the United States to do something, trying to get things done. Nobody at the UN would listen to them. They were there lobbying the UN Security Council. They were there. They were providing information to people in the State Department. But if the president doesn't respond, or if the Europe citizen doesn't do anything, what can they do? They're just NGOs. So this has been a really big challenge for them, because one of the quote-unquote functions of advocacy NGOs is the warning bell function. To ring the bell, kind of get everybody to see there's a problem here. But the big challenge, I think, is how do you make a problem politically important so that states will respond? We're still struggling.
Right, we are.
Look, DeFore is a really good example of that. They've been screaming and yelling, but nobody is taking it as seriously as they can or should. So that's the challenge, and that's the dilemma that a lot of NGOs are in, is that they're trying to always, they get in the affair to call it, genocide, Olympics, or this and that, to try and get the Chinese involved. But if they don't get involved, and if that's actually kind of working now, it's a challenge. It's really tough. But I know that there are a lot of NGOs that have spent a lot of their energy on this. It's just how do you get states to respond?
Exactly.
My question is for Kim, I think. You talked about a lot of money going into these organizations, which in itself isn't necessarily a good thing. My question is, I get the sense that a lot of that goes into the black hole of administrative costs and corruption, and as individuals who are trying to decide where to send their charitable dollars, where do we find results and where do we find oversight?
Those are good questions. She can probably answer some of them too, coming from one of these organizations. Actually, taking government funding, you can't use too much for overhead. It pretty much defines how much, and actually you probably sometimes have to put money into it. So there are a lot of strings tied to government aid, and you have to keep it more accountable in many ways than you do other just money from the general public. In fact, money from the general public will help you support some of the administrative stuff. But I don't know, it raises a lot of interesting questions and dilemmas, actually, because on the one hand, I think that there's this whole idea that you want minimum overhead, but there's a trade-off, I think, between minimum overhead and massive amounts going out there and actually good results. Because you don't want tons of stuff going into administrative stuff, by no means. But you also have to hire people who have technical expertise and know what they're doing, unless you want to just ship goods over there. What is it that aid is supposed to be about? If you want actually people with high technical abilities, you want to hire people who are good and can actually use the money creatively, you're going to have to put some money into the salaries. So there's a trade-off, and there are choices that you have to make. And so I think while it's good to have low overhead and a lot of that stuff to a certain extent, I don't think that's the whole story. And you can have different kinds of NGOs doing different kinds of work, that some of them are going to have a little more overhead because you have expertise that are going over there and doing much better work. And you're going to have different kinds of results if you have different kinds of these goals. So I think I would say it depends on what do you want to do with your money. What kind of a charity do you want to support? What kind of aid do you want to support? If you're interested in like a specific disease, then I wouldn't worry too much about the overhead so much as to like science and investing in that kind of thing. But if you just want to get goods to an emergency area, look for an NGO that has good overhead and moves and transport that stuff. So it kind of depends on that, but I think that it's a lot more sophisticated and complicated than what is often presented in the media and presented out there. It is tricky because there are some NGOs that aren't doing a very good job, and then you have really good ones. I would look at their annual reports. I would look at their webpage, find as much information as you can, but also be very targeted in what kind of thing you want to support as well. And that will help you narrow it down, I think, and help you make some decisions in that area.
Did you want to say anything? The only, if I could just add, because this is a question, as a speaking for CARE, you can look at our annual report, you can go online, what you'll see is that when you look at our funding and you look at all our expenses, our ratio of overhead to program support is 90% for program and 10% for overhead, fundraising, management, etc. That's really good. That's about as good as you can get. I'll echo what Kim says, though. More and more, I think it is critically important for smart donors and people who want to make a difference to question the sacred cow of overhead, because you don't want it to be a black hole. But you do want, as Kim said, if you've got sophisticated problems, to be able to put sophisticated solutions. And that not only in terms of the people that you have, talk about technology. I mean, I can tell you, I can look at my computer and go, this is weird one. I say, well, because I'm a CARE. I mean, you can, it's an okay computer, but the setup is all right, not great. And then you need to think about how do you make the people that you have most efficient. We're dealing with vast. So there's that. And but there's lots of information available, and I think it's one thing that I will tell you is if you're and especially if you're giving substantial amounts, you want to be sure that you're giving to an organization that will report to you what they're doing with their money, and we do that. For small donors, we do that through newsletters, we do it through the website, we do it through a variety. But for any donor who's giving a few $1,000s more, they are given a report on where their money is going. And so there are some things you can put in place to make sure you know what's happening with your money.
In our reading, we learned that less than 25% of all financial flows come from the rich nations to the poor nations. Less than 25% of the money that is used for that. So the vast bulk of it is from religious organizations and donors and private donors and the like. Which brings to mind a couple of questions. When the government, say our government, gives money to an NGO, what sort of strings are attached to that? I think you've already kind of alluded to it. What countries benefit the most from the government money and from all the money? And what percent of our U.S. budget constitutes foreign aid? If either one of you or both of you can address that.
We're trying to confirm with each other. If I had a different colleague here from CARE, I could tell you, because our policy people, we have somebody in government relations in Washington who knows this like the back of our hand, but I think our government support of foreign aid, international development aid, is I think 1% of the total budget, or 1.7, I can't remember, but it's not very much. So that's that answer. And the G8 has made a pact to sort of, I forget what the number is, that's the problem. The G8 countries sort of made an agreement that by, I think, 2015, they would move to try to get up to 2 or 3% of their annual budgets. And there's a ranking of which countries are at the highest, and the Norwegian, the Scandinavians are at that level. We're not. Now, in actual dollars, we're the biggest provider of international aid of any country on the planet by a long shot, but proportionally, in proportion to our budget, it's smaller. I always find that interesting because when you get into those discussions, you allude to, but on the other hand, Americans give more money than any other country through the private support of these. Even if only 2% of total giving to charities going to international aid, when you add that 2% up, it's quite a bit more than what the publics, because they're smaller and also for a variety of reasons, give less. They don't have the same philanthropic, private philanthropic traditions that we have. So if you add our private support and our public support, you get a lot closer to the some of the European countries who, and that's a very complex topic.
I think because in terms of percentage of budget, I don't know, but the goal has been for a long time 1% of GDP.
Yeah.
We've never gotten close to 1% of GDP. And since 2001, we've been the #1 donor, but actually all the 90s, the Japanese beat us.
Oh, really?
A decade, okay? Our foreign aid spending was pretty low in the 90s. We had serious foreign aid fatigue, and Republicans did not want to fund this during the 90s, and you know what happened in the 90s in politics there. So it's actually gone up and down a lot. And the war on terror had a lot to do with foreign aid going up. I mean, everything, the foreign aid situation in general has changed because of the war on terror and September 11. I mean, we put a lot of money into Africa, into HIV/AIDS. I mean, it's amazing how it became kind of an opportunity to spend a lot more money to get countries to have better feelings about us and to show that we actually care about the rest of the world. So I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky question, though. I mean, we do have a lot more private giving in the States, but part of that has to do with not only our giving traditions, but the fact that we get tax breaks for this.
Well, that's what, yeah.
We have a government that decided that we want to encourage people to spend their money in charity, and actually that's why we have a big nonprofit sector. This is the government doesn't do it. They give tax breaks to rich people and all of us to do all the work and to fund it that way. So the choices are different. You know, if you're in Scandinavia, you have a high tax, but you get a lot back, and the government gives a lot to aid, so you don't see as much giving because it's all done through taxes. So there are different ways of doing things, and there are different ways in which a lot of this philanthropy comes out. The government in Scandinavia decides. And that's good, but it's also bad if you want to have a say. But actually, they work so close together, like the NGOs and the government, they change hats all the time. They're working one day, they're in a ministry, next day they're working in the NGO. It's like, it's a very different world. It's kind of hard to, it's very, very different. They're not really, they're like apples and oranges in some ways. So even though it's great we have this philanthropic tradition, I think it's wonderful, it is actually also giving rich people a lot of power to not put their money in the government, but just decide where the money is going to go.
It's a different philosophy. You know, I have colleagues who work for CARE in Europe, where we have 11 CARE countries, and as they try to expand their base of giving to the public, you know, they're dealing with a whole society, traditions that don't really support that, and not just because people don't want to give it, it's not part of their culture, and it's not part of the tax structure. So, one last thing though, you did ask about are strings attached and what kind of strings, and I won't go, I mean, that's, sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't, there's a whole different, Kim probably knows way more about it than people, but there are many instances where, you know, HIV/AIDS is a good example, where under the current administration, there's been tremendous support for HIV/AIDS funding, a lot of good stuff, but some of the policies and some of the ideas about how that money should be spent and what kind of on-the-ground work should be done just don't necessarily match up with what NGOs like CARE and others think are the most effective means of solving that problem. And so it's complicated. So that's where advocacy comes in terms of working to try to get changes in the provisions and the earmarks and the strings attached to that kind of funding.
Well, I think that it changes all the time. I mean, it would be like this year or 10 years ago or during the Cold War when, you know, there's been a lot, but there's also been a lot that has actually not been, it's just waiting. It's on hold, because they want the government to be more, they want good governance, and if the government isn't good, they're not going to get the funding yet, so a lot of governments haven't gotten funding, that's just kind of waiting there for it, for them. There are a lot of, I mean, this aid is such a complex issue, and there's some great things happening, and there's some horrible things happening. And NGO funding, there's so many different kinds of grants and funds that you can get, it would be hard to generalize. Some of them are just really project specific. Some of them have serious strings attached, so NGOs will not touch it. They'll be like, don't want those conditions. There was in Iraq, I think there was a whole controversy shortly after the war is over about having to report to USAID to vet any press statements. So NGOs working there are like, we want to be able to talk to the press and just say what we want without being approved by you. They dropped all of their USAID money in Iraq. So it really depends on the case, it really depends on the project. It's hard to generalize completely. And I know that's not a satisfying answer, because it would be nice to just say good or bad.
First, I would like to thank you for all the great work you do throughout the world, but I felt a little bit shocked to see, I don't know if I was reading your graph well, that, for instance, Mexico is disqualified to receive the help from CARE. I would like to know what really disqualifies Mexico from receiving this help. That's only my reading. I don't know if I understood your chart correctly. That's like one question. And the second question is related to, the first one is for CARE, but the second one is for Professor Kim. And I would like to know, in the decision making of whoever makes this decision of where this aid goes in the world, if we wouldn't have to prioritize, like to take this help to Mexico and reduce our illegal immigration issues in the United States. I mean, if there is something that international policy allows to do something like that for the discomfort that we feel about illegal immigration in the United States.
So you have good eyes. I guess you were referring to the map, and you can see the red dot in Mexico. And it is true that here doesn't work in Mexico. We did work in Mexico. In fact, Mexico, I think, was one of the first countries that, after the war, because all our original work was actually in Europe. In fact, our initial name was Cooperative for American Relief to Europe. But as we moved past, we're not hardly in Europe at all anymore. I think Mexico was the first country that we moved to in the 1950s. But we do enter and exit countries based on where we see the greatest need. Now, I know that doesn't sound like, well, it's not just need in Mexico. It's just, where's the greatest need? And we're talking about multitudes of people on less than $1 a day. That's the population that CARE is targeting. We're targeting the poorest of the poor in greatest numbers, and often in countries where there's little capacity or has been little capacity for their local governance to help or for aid flowing there. So a place like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it's very difficult to get private or public money in, are the kinds of places that CARE focuses on. So we withdraw from some countries where we don't see that those conditions are necessarily the greatest. I can't speak to Mexico in detail, but that would be how we do it. Notice we don't work in the U.S. I don't think there's anybody who could argue that we don't have poverty in the United States, because we just think that there are other players who can more effectively deliver service than here. Over here?
Oh, I'm not, sorry, I'm getting the second question about Mexico. I'm not 100% sure what your question was in terms of aid and illegal immigration problem. I think most of foreign aid does not target that kind of problem. And I think you're hinting at the economic problems in Mexico leading people to, like Deborah said, the foreign aid is going to places where the average, per capita income is much lower than Mexico. Mexico is actually doing pretty good compared to a lot of places. And you may not think this, but if you've been to some of these other countries, You know, aid's not going to Thailand. Aid's not going to a lot of different places where once the GDP started to go up, because you see cars, there's just a lot of things you don't see in some of these really, really poor places. So, you know, in ways, it's, you know, it would be good to have more of that stuff, but there has to be priorities, and it's almost good if you graduate from getting it. That's actually a good sign. It means that you're a functioning economy. It means actually a lot of really good things. So if you saw some of the basket case countries that are getting it, you don't want to be like that.
Yeah, I always say our job is to put ourselves out of business, right? Not to be
Okay, sorry.
I want to say, first off, CARE has always appealed to me, mostly because of your pushing of the self-help. Because I'm one of those people that believe people should feel like they're helping themselves, not that you're handling something. And a good part of my question had to do with the black hole question we got over there. But I do wonder how we could possibly set up a system whereby those of us giving money would know that that money isn't going to be going to profiteers that know when all those billions of dollars are floating around, that they profiteer on it, but goes to actually help the people get their own dignity back.
You know, and it's, I can only speak for us and say a little bit, have to have a bit of faith, because I've been out to the countries where we work. You know, we put systems in place where the money that comes in is monitored extremely carefully. I wouldn't say that there's never any, you know, I've never seen an instance that I'm aware of actual corruption on the parts of our people, but it's ultimately it comes down to trying to get to know the organization as well as you can. We do a lot to try to report to our donors through the web, through mailing pieces. For donors who are able to travel overseas, we often take them on trips so they can see how the work is done. And when you do see how it's done in the communities that we serve, I think it's, you know, it's pretty clear that it's being done. I mean, I think the larger issue is not so much the profiteering or is it being siphoned off of places, is more this issue of, is it sustainable? Will it last? You know, how do I measure the impact and tell you exactly, you know, your money that you gave not only made a difference in that boy or girl's life, but, you know, you can be assured that we've made a lasting difference in the community. I'm not saying we don't, but I think that's the harder metric to prove. That's the thing that NGOs struggle with a lot. So,
And I think we have time for maybe one more question, so you can all fight over it. Okay.
One of you or both of you would get down to the nitty-gritty the family health planning, and because what we're getting is that basically in newspapers and television is that our government has affected this so much throughout the world. Are there other governments that are giving you the money for this? Are you affected CARE with the family planning issues?
I'm not the best expert on that. That's a complicated issue. We do get money for work that involves family planning, and we do get government money. I mean, but there are real strictures in some of the government programs with AIDS, you know, ABC, you know, abstinence, condoms, and not being able to do as much in some of the programming unless it's tied to the AB part, not so there's that issue. We're getting around some of that, and what you sometimes find actually that with USAID, which is where a lot of that money comes from, the actual implementers of those programs sometimes look the other way from what the policy is. I mean, that's what we find on the ground. So, I mean, anything related, we're not, the issues on abortion, that's, I mean, what a tough issue that is in this country as well as all over the world. CARE does not get engaged in that, so we don't have a problem there. But frankly, when we get back to maternal health care, you know, one of the leading causes of death of women is bleeding and hemorrhaging from unsafe abortion. So there's no way that issue doesn't I'd say here's another one where, related to, CARE does a lot of work in countries with, this is a term I didn't know until I came to the NGO world, sex workers, women who are prostitutes. And we work with them to help them have safe practices, really, and to help protect their health. We also do a lot of work with them in terms of building esteem and dignity, ideally, ultimately, perhaps to be able to move out of that life, but maybe they won't. There was policy around, in the U.S. government around having to sign a pledge that CARE, any NGO who gets money to do this kind of work would sign a pledge that we're anti-prostitution. Now, it's not that CARE is pro-prostitution, but, our mission is a humanitarian organization. We work with people from every walk of life to help them protect themselves and to live the healthiest life that they can live in their circumstances, or move past those circumstances if they can. So, in doing that, this gets you back to local partner organizations. So in India, we work a lot with local NGOs, Indian charities and NGOs who also work with these communities of sex workers. And in some cases, the local NGOs are advocating for the legalization of prostitution. So then the affiliation of CARE with those institutions can cause a problem for us in signing a pledge, So that's the kind of conundrum you run into, where maybe more enlightened policy, which would be driven by actually seeing the work on the ground and not playing to the local politics and local emotions around issues that are very personal, might be helpful.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that unfortunately